Hi there, welcome to Friday's Indycar. I'm Gordon Ross. Today I'm in Bearsden. It's a beautiful sunny morning, and taking up where I left off recently, yesterday in fact, about the routine arming of English rural police officers. Now, since I made the programme yesterday where I raised concerns about the possible reasons why the police chiefs in England might want to arm their rural police officers, I was contacted by a retired police officer who has some inside knowledge of how the Scottish police force and other police forces around the world where he's worked as a police weapons training officer and in other roles in various countries in policing. What he was telling me was very interesting and made a lot more sense when you start to examine the facts. In England, for example, he was pointing out that the rural police forces who are not armed, it takes longer to get an armed response vehicle to assist them if they come across any kind of dangerous activity involving either terrorism or criminal gangs or drug dealers who happen to be armed with firearms. So they are a lot further away from help if it's needed, and therefore the thinking is it would be useful for some of those officers to be given some training in handgun use, so that they have a chance, if there is anything goes down, to have an officer there much more quickly. Now, as he was pointing out to me, in all of the police forces in England, Wales and in Scotland, police officers have to volunteer for firearms training. It's not mandatory. The police officers themselves can't be forced to carry weapons. And this was an interesting part of the discussion, and I was very happy to hear this information from this individual yesterday because it filled in a lot of gaps which worry people. However, the situation in Scotland is slightly different, because I was asking the question about who the Scottish police are answerable to, and when it comes down to it, the Scottish police are answerable to the Scottish Parliament. That's basically the line manager. But overall policing in the United Kingdom is coordinated overall through Westminster and Holyrood working together. There is a policing by consent, but there is also a link-up, a little bit like Interpol, where some of the general principles of policing, particularly for emergencies and developing disasters and say mass events where large numbers of people are involved, for example, these are subject to national strategies which have been developed by both the Metropolitan Police and Police Scotland and other police forces, all acting together to the same standard. So that's answered quite a lot of the questions I posed yesterday, and I thought I should bring that information forward because I don't want to be accused of being a scaremonger, but the point is that the public don't often get this information in detail. So we now know that the English police force, although they're talking about arming their officers in rural areas, it will not be mandatory. They're going to ask for volunteers in these local areas to take firearms training, so that some officers are available locally if they're needed in an emergency, and they're much closer to whatever the incident is. So if there's backup needed, armed backup needed, it doesn't have to come from a major town 25 miles away. So that was a development from yesterday's story. Now also today I wanted to talk a little bit more about what happens to Scotland's security after we become independent, because if you think about this, if Scotland becomes independent, which we all hope it will, and we're all expecting it will when we vote for it, but afterwards, what kind of police and security service will we need? Where are the threats going to come from? A new country like Scotland, which has zero history of invading anybody or upsetting anybody else in other countries, should have no real enemies, no terrorist threats other than domestic ones. Domestic ones, I mean people like religious extremists, homegrown. So I'm thinking particularly of sectarian terrorism here, although it's very, very unlikely that this would happen. There must be one or two isolated individuals who might want to try something. But the point is, what kind of security service would we need after independence? And it seems to me that rather than launching straight into giving ourselves an armed force, an army, it would probably be wise to create a covert security service, a bit like MI5, but not maybe not as big and with a different remit. The remit would be primarily to infiltrate and unearth any plots for things like people trafficking or drug smuggling. Remember, Scotland has hundreds and hundreds of miles of desolate coastline where there's very little in the way of security. It's an open door for people traffickers who want to get illegal migrants into the UK by landing them somewhere in Scotland and then driving them down into England to join whoever it is they want to join down there. So Scotland could become an open gate, an open door for human traffic. There is also, and we know this anyway, that drug dealers sometimes use very remote inlets and sea locks, places like that, to bring drugs ashore from small boats. So that's something else we would need to do. So our security force would probably need to work more in rural areas, interestingly, and also would need to be equipped with things like patrol boats. So we're talking really a lot more about coastal security and perhaps some minor domestic terrorist threats between, say, Scotland and Northern Ireland, just for example. Now, yesterday, talking of Northern Ireland reminds me of something I saw on a feed yesterday. I'm not sure whether it's true or not, but somebody reported that the DUP were in some kind of talks with the Irish government over the possibility of a Northern Irish border poll. Now, this would be a vote taken on whether there should be a border or not. This would be a poll of Northern Irish people, I'm presuming. And if it was decided that there should not be a border built, a solid border built, then there was the option of talking about unifying Ireland again. Now, this struck me as being completely out of left field. I've never heard the DUP ever talking about unification with the Irish government. So it could be just a rumour, but it came across my feeds yesterday. I don't know if anyone else has seen it or if anybody has a source for this story. It'd be interesting to know if it's true or not. Strikes me that they're probably just talking about a poll, but you never know. It's 2018, and in 2017 anything could happen. In 2018 virtually everything can happen, so who knows? We're down the rabbit hole with Brexit and Trump. We could be down the rabbit hole with reunification. Either way, if Ireland reunifies, that would be fantastic for Ireland, but it might again spark some domestic terrorism, and it might also provoke some domestic terrorism in Scotland. For example, the smuggling of weapons to dissidents in Ireland from Scotland. This has happened before. So it feeds back to my original question about what kind of security service Scotland actually needs after independence. Does it need an army? I don't think it needs an army. I think it needs a security force, and a security force which can act on the sea and on the air and on the land, but it's not a standing army that we need. It's specialists in counter-terrorism, specialists in infiltrating smuggling and trafficking groups and arms dealing groups. These, I think, are the major threats. Now, obviously, we will need a navy to protect our coastal assets, including our tide and wind turbine arrays, as well as our oil and gas fields. So that's a given. We will need a navy. I'm not saying that we don't. And we probably need a small air force as well to patrol the coasts and land. But all of this is really pointing the way towards a defence force, not an offensive army like we have in England, where we've got aircraft carriers projecting force abroad. The British strategy is to try and be a global policeman along with America, and it's the way they see themselves. This is why they've built 2 aircraft carriers. This is why they continue to have nuclear weapons. Moving on. Okay, the second piece of news today is that a poll was published recently, in fact yesterday, which said that English voters thought that Scotland was less important in Brexit terms than Gibraltar, and they would be willing to sacrifice the entire union with Scotland in order to secure Gibraltar as after Brexit. In other words, they felt that Gibraltar's strategic value to England was higher than Scotland's strategic value was. Interesting stuff, that the English voters' perception of Scotland is very different from the British government's. Would the British government actually construct any kind of policy based on what English voters think? I don't think so, because although English voters have been given this impression of Scotland as being a useless burden that they would gladly get rid of, whereas Gibraltar to them is an essential outpost of the British military infrastructure. It's a resupply base for the British Navy as it sails into the Mediterranean, with its air base over at Akrotiri on, I think it's Akrotiri, I don't remember the name right, but Akrotiri is, as far as I remember, is a British military airfield on Cyprus. And it is used by both British and American bombers when they are bombing the Middle East. So this whole idea of projecting force is reliant on Gibraltar as part of the staging post for these attacks. And it's part of a Western network involving both the UK and America and France. Would the Spanish be happy to share Gibraltar? Well, interestingly, I think if the Spanish decided to do a deal with England after Scotland left, let's say, but if they did a deal with England to share Gibraltar, Gibraltarians would see a massive increase in activity in Gibraltar, because the Spanish Navy, which does use the port anyway under agreements to some extent, the Spanish Navy and the British Navy could act together and could expand facilities in Gibraltar, which would be good for them, be good for Gibraltar, and it might be good for Spanish and British relations. There is another fly in the ointment, which is that if Scotland becomes independent, what happens to Faslane and Trident? Well, I've already done a show where I pointed out that England has a vast nuclear weapons storage facility at one of its airfields, as well as Aldermaston, where the warheads are actually built and armed and maintained. There is a nuclear weapons storage facility under an English airfield, and it's massive. It holds hundreds of nuclear warheads at any one time. So there is no problem about taking the nuclear tips off the missiles and transporting them back to England after independence. The fact that the British government is steamrolling ahead with this massive new infrastructure plan for both Faslane to be enlarged to take the entire submarine fleet for the UK, and also for Rosyth to be expanded to take on all the work of decommissioning the nuclear reactors in those submarines, means that the British government doesn't give a toss about Scotland. They don't care whether we vote for independence or not. They think that by steamrolling ahead with their plans for both Faslane and for Rosyth, that will make people want to keep the union, to keep these jobs in Scotland, failing to notice the fact that nearly all the jobs in Faslane are provided to British service personnel who are flown in, sailed in, or otherwise parachuted into Scotland, and who provide very little to the local economy. There are in fact somewhere in the region of only 400 or 500 local jobs supported by Faslane at all. Now remember that once Scotland is independent, if that base is then negotiated to be part of the Scottish military infrastructure, then that base will be fully manned with Scottish personnel who will live locally, and there will be none of this parachuting people in from other parts of the UK who then go home at the weekend. Everybody who works in Faslane will be a Scottish person, somebody who lives in Scotland and pays taxes here, pardon me, and also is part of the local community. So even though the nuclear weapons will go, the Scottish military base will be there, and the centre of military operations will be there, because all the infrastructure is already in place. The dock is there. It can take all of the military surface fleet that Scotland requires to keep its coastline secure. and it's very close to the central belt, which is something we've always pointed out in the past as a disadvantage for a nuclear base, will be a major advantage for a civilian defensive base. So looking long term at this, Brexit for English people, if they do think that Scotland is expendable, and they do cut Scotland loose after we vote for independence, and that's all fine, then England would be able to negotiate a deal over Gibraltar with Spain. But they'd have to do it because, having lost Scotland, they will lose a fair chunk of their income. And one of the ways that they could make up for that would be to do a deal with Spain over Gibraltar. And doing a sort of power sharing or facilities sharing deal with Gibraltar would be beneficial to the British state, because it would be able to continue its warmongering in the Middle East as happily as ever, and so its arms trading could go on unabated, and Scotland could do what it wanted to do, which is basically just to defend its own territory. But remember, as I pointed out, that Scotland will become an open door to people traffickers, drug smugglers and arms dealers, or arms weapons smugglers as well. Because we have a big leaky coastline, we will need a big defensive force to protect ourselves against that. People traffickers are very ingenious, and if they can't get people directly into England from the south coast, they will simply sail across the North Sea and bring them into some quiet little bay somewhere in the north of Scotland, put them on a minibus and drive them over the border into England. They will find ways of using Scotland as a jumping off point to get into England. So we have a lot of issues that we need to think about when it comes to security, but one of them is not having an offensive Army, Navy and Air Force. We don't need it, because we won't have the enemies that England has by its continued war fighting in the Middle East. The more it fights in the Middle East, the more domestic terrorism there will be in what's left of the UK. If Ireland reunifies, then that takes one big problem away in terms of terrorism, but it creates possibly another, which would be loyalist paramilitaries and dissidents in Northern Ireland trying to get weapons to mount terror attacks in the Republic. So there are all sorts of shifting nuances in this situation. But the issue with Gibraltar strikes me as an opportunity rather than a threat. And I think people who saw this poll yesterday will probably think, yeah, it's wonderful because it puts pressure on the British government to let Scotland go and to concentrate more on Gibraltar as an asset instead of Scotland. Don't know if it will happen. I have my doubts about whether the British government thinks the same way as the English voters. English voters, remember, have been fed a diet of Scotland's too poor, too stupid, and it's a burden on the English state, and it's your tax money in England that's paying for Scotland's NHS and all this. These fables have been put about by the BBC and other media in England for decades, and so people are completely convinced that Scotland is a lame duck and they should just cast us adrift. Well, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe if everybody in England thinks that, they can put pressure on their MPs and put pressure on the Tory party to actually let Scotland become independent. And then we won't be a burden on England anymore, will we? And we'll just see exactly how England gets on by itself, and we'll see how Scotland gets on by itself with all of its resources intact and without anybody ripping them off and taking them away without paying us for them anymore. Anyway, that's all I have to say today. It's a very big, messy picture as usual in the political scene, but I'm hoping the information I've given you about the police, the armed police situation is helpful, and a little bit more detail on it might help to allay some of our fears about what's being planned in England and why. Anyway, I'm off. Have a good weekend, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the show. As usual, contact me afterwards if you have any suggestions. By the way, one postscript for you. I wanted to mention the fact that we are expecting a large contingent of people to go down to Dumfries for the big march and rally on the 27th of May. That's Sunday. There is this Saturday in Elmbank Street at the Quaker Halls The events organisers are looking for volunteer facilitators to come along to be trained for the event. I believe I think it's from 2 till 5:30, but check the website for details. But the idea is, if you go along to the event at Elmbank Street tomorrow, you can be trained as a facilitator for helping to organise discussions among those who attend. You'll also get a free ticket for the event, and you'll be provided with food and even transport costs to get to Dumfries. So that's tomorrow afternoon, Elmbank Street at the Quaker Hall. So if you're interested in volunteering for that, please do so tomorrow. As I said, the event is on the 27th of May. The organisers tell me that the subscriptions for this event are selling fast now, and they're expecting a massive turnout in Dumfries. So get along to Elmbank Street tomorrow, the Quaker Hall, Quaker meeting rooms in Elmbank Street tomorrow afternoon if you're interested in volunteering. I'll see you all later. Have a good weekend. Bye for now.